March 8th. Is anti-Semitism as old as recorded history? Well, in my opinion, it is, and we have historical documents to prove it. This year, from Sundown March 6th to Sundown March 7th, just yesterday, the Feast of Purim was celebrated. This celebration's origin is recorded in the Book of Esther. For those of you who have a Bible nearby or can access the Bible online, I encourage you to read or reread the story of Esther. It is a mere 10 chapters, and each time you read it, you will discover something new and amazing. And researching some commentary on it from credible sources, Jewish and Christian alike, will enlighten you to even more messages from the book. The Book of Esther is unique in that God or any direct reference to him is missing. It's veiled. It's behind a mask. However, the Jewish identity and faith of both Esther and Mordechai are evident, as well. No mention of Jerusalem or Judea or the land of Israel in the book. But we do know that during Esther's time, Jews were returning from exile to Jerusalem, and we are just a few generations out from when Daniel was first made captive and taken to Persia. We can spend hours discussing the insights and revelations of the Book of Esther, his plan, God's plan, his timeline, the history of human nature and the Jewish people, and more. But I want to draw out a few direct connections to the happenings in the book and modern-day anti-Semitism. Mordecai was a well-assimilated man in the Persian culture. He was high up in the ranks of society, having a Persian name, dressing in Persian clothes, and enjoying Persian life. He was respected and engaged in commerce and government. We also surmise that he didn't really hide his Jewish identity, but he didn't flaunt it either, and this kind of reminds me of many Jews and Christians today. We also know that Esther was told not to reveal her Jewishness when she went to the palace. And we need to think that maybe Mordecai's directive for this was a nudge from the Holy Spirit. We normally don't tell our children to hide their faith, but rather to proclaim it. Yet we do realize there's times when we should observe and remain silent to learn and gain wisdom, and do not actively say or do anything that contradicts our faith, but to remain quiet and observant. The first of the two anti-Semitism that we can identify is that of assimilation, meaning people don't like Jews or Jewish people, and they forgive them of that if that Jewish person converts or shuns their Jewishness. Converts to Christianity, for example, in Europe, after the Europeans became Christian, or integrating into any society, Jews are then accepted more and not targets. And we saw this with Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation. He befriended the rabbis and the Jewish communities, often dining with them and speaking with them. But when they rejected the message of Christ and salvation, he became bitter towards them. And unfortunately, Hitler used many of Luther's later writings that his wife Catherine begged him not to send along because she knew they were vitriolic and not necessarily of Luther's right mind. But Hitler used those writings to convince people of his validity to hate the Jews many centuries later. We also have the second type of anti-Semitism, and that is of Jewishness being a trait or in the blood that no amount of assimilation can shun. And that is the kind of anti-Semitism that we saw in Hitler and the Nazi regime, where people could convert or say that they don't want to be Jewish or they're not practicing their Judaism, and yet they were targeted for extermination. We also see this same type of anti-Semitism in radical Islamic theology and with terrorist groups and organizations such as the PA, Palestinian Authority, or Hamas in their leadership among their edicts. So we need to understand that these two kinds of anti-Semitism were going on in the Persian Empire, even though the Persian Empire as a whole was pretty tolerant of Jewish people and certainly accepting of them when they assimilate. But we also know that Haman got the government by King Xerxes to issue an edict allowing the extermination of the Jews. And this is the crisis point upon which Mordecai shuns his Persian identity, so to speak, and reveals his full Jewishness. He goes into the gates of the king, which are basically the office buildings in the town square, and he is dressed identifiably as a Jew. He is mourning. He's in Jewish mourning clothes, and he also sends a message to Esther that at this point she needs to go to the king and reveal her identity. And those were two dangerous things to do, because you don't go to the king, you wait till you are requested by him, and then you also don't necessarily flaunt your Jewishness when there's an edict out to destroy you. So what we can learn from this that I parallel to modern day is that we see crises against Jews and even Christians, where at that point the assimilated Jews and Christians in society, the ones who are not hiding their faith, but who have risen up among the culture or society in business and politics and entertainment, they will then begin to reveal their identity and fight against that tide, against their faith, against God. And we see this with athletes, we see this with coaches, we see this in news media commentators. Every once in a while, there'll be something that comes up where faith is at crisis or somehow railed against by the greater culture, or even in a law, and the Christians and Jews, who are normally not that active in sharing their faith, will then come forth and take a leadership position to share it and affect change. We also can learn from the Book of Esther that not everything is a violent or outspoken protest with signage in front of an office building, although I'm not discounting that as a method. But in this story, we see how two faithful people work their way up the ranks of the culture and the society, and they find favor. And I do not believe they do anything against their faith. They're just sort of quiet about it until the time comes that they need to reveal it. And that's an interesting thing about the Book of Esther, because the celebrations include wearing a mask, and to me that symbolizes that sometimes God's work, whether it is God's hand itself in a miracle, such as turning the tables in the Book of Esther, no parting of the Red Sea or quelling fiery furnaces, but instead it's a matter of miraculous circumstances that twist around, and that Mordecai and Esther are not revealing everything about themselves straight away, but they are studying and working from inside the system to effect a change. We also learn that God will work things out and he will have his hand behind circumstances, but we also have to participate and do something. For such a time as this, if we don't rise up, God will have somebody else do it. But don't you want to be part of God's plan and to act with discernment and faithfulness and with clarity and reason, knowing that your voice or your movements or your actions are at the right place at the right time? And that requires knowledge of the Word, daily reading of the Word, and praying about events that are going on globally or locally or in your own life or family. So the Book of Esther has so much to teach us, and I just encourage you to give it a reread at least once a year and celebrate Purim as you best can when it comes around, because the idea is to celebrate that life is defeating death, and that God's hand is behind it all, and that we can be participants even when we feel like it's at our own peril, but to have that trust and faith that when we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, in the end, it will work out. A great piece of literature is the Book of Esther, but it's also an inspiring story, and we know that the annals of Esther and her time in the palace were beneficial to generations to come and give Jewish people and Christians inspiration and hope that our work is worthwhile. Shavua Tov, and have a great week.